What's up guys, my name is Ace, and the beta for Modern Warfare 2 is now live for everyone on the PlayStation platform at least. And in order to make sure you guys get the best experience possible with the beta, I wanted to do a best settings video, because I honestly feel many of these settings can have a pretty significant impact on the enjoyability of the game. There are some key settings that really make the game feel and look better, and I wanted to make sure I'm covering those, like I said, to make sure you guys get the best experience possible, so then you can provide the best feedback possible. And without further ado, let's dive right into the settings, and you can kind of ignore the quick settings since all of these are essentially contained in the more detailed settings that we're going to be going through. So let's start off with the controller settings that I use, keeping in mind this particular section is highly subjective. Use what feels best for you, but I'm going to share what I like to use here. And with this, I like using the tactical layout. I don't use flipped. I always like turning vibration as well as the trigger effect off. I feel like those are just distractions if you're trying to perform as well as possible. When it comes to sensitivity, I'm using 7 and 7 with 8.7 ADS multiplier. Then skipping down to the gameplay aspect here, I personally like prioritizing reload for multiplayer, not so much for Warzone, but in multiplayer I find that I typically want to be reloading more often and I don't want to accidentally pick up somebody's gun, so I usually use that setting there. And then I put armor plate behavior to apply all. That's mainly going to be for game modes that will have armor plates. Doesn't really apply to the multiplayer side. As for the advanced settings, if you tab over here, when it comes to target assist, of course, I've got that on, and I like the default aim assist. Focusing and precision, eliminate aim assist rotation. I don't really like that. And then when it comes to the Black Ops setting, I still can't really tell much of a difference between Black Ops and the standard. As for my aim response curve, I like using standard, but of course, use what your preference is. I know a lot of people lean more toward dynamic, but for me, standard is the way to go. Now, getting into some of the most important settings here, this is going to be our input dead zones. And this is where you want to be dropping your left and right stick dead zones especially. These are the most important settings. If these are set too high, which by default I believe they're set to 15, it can feel like there's input lag with your controller. It feels like you move your stick and it takes a little while for the game to react to that. So I'd recommend dropping these as low as possible without getting stick drift. For my controller, down to 0.03 feels pretty good there, but definitely the lower the better when it comes to this particular setting. I also like dropping my button dead zone for L2 and R2. That one's less important, but it is just a little bit more responsive if you drop this down. So when you pull the trigger to fire a gun, it will fire just that little bit faster. Now, when it comes to my movement behavior settings, these ones I generally kept pretty basic. I like the standard settings for the most part. I did switch this to partial for airborne automatic mantle. I think that's just a little bit better than the constant automatic mantle. Also, when swimming is involved, which it isn't really in the current state of the beta, I prefer using plunge freely, but again, that's just a personal preference sort of thing. And everything else on here, I just left default. Everything else just feels great when it comes to the controller settings. Again, personal preference is going to come to play here, so if you feel like you want to adjust something, then make sure you do that. Now, let's tab back over to the graphics settings. We're not covering keyboard and mouse today. I'm not a keyboard and mouse player, simple as that. And in the graphics setting, I personally leave on-demand texture streaming on, and I have it to the large allocated texture cache size as well. This one may be a little bit different depending on your internet. For some people, like if you're experiencing a lot of packet loss, I'd recommend turning this setting off completely. But if you have really good internet, you don't have any problems with packet loss, turn this on and your game will look a little bit better. As for motion blur, we always want to turn motion blur off in any sort of competitive environment. It just gets in the way and potentially prevents you from being able to see some key information that you need to see. Same thing with film grain. This is more for a cinematic look. It's not good for a competitive environment. And also depth of field. Make sure you're turning that off. This is going to make things blurry, and you don't want things to be blurry when you're trying to find your targets. After that, we have the Fidelity FX setting, and this is one I get asked about a ton. Should you have this on or off? And if you do have it on, what should the strength be? Now, for those that don't know, Fidelity FX is basically the sharpness of your game, and having it off means that your game is often going to have really soft edges. And in my opinion, they're a little bit too soft, and this can actually harm your visibility a bit in game. And let's have a look at an example of this. This is what it looks like with Fidelity FX off, and then this is what it looks like with Fidelity FX cranked to the max. It might look fairly subtle here, but when you zoom in on this particular area right here, for instance, you can see that you've got a much more sharp edge, and that, I feel, actually helps a good amount with the visibility in the game. I feel like character models are popping a little bit more rather than sort of blurring and blending into the environment. So with this one, I would highly recommend having it on to some degree, and I'm kind of liking sitting in the middle. I feel like if I crank it all the way to the max, it can be a little overkill. But this will come down to preference a little bit. I'd recommend playing around with it, but I'd say you should definitely turn this one on. Now, moving on to field of view, again, this does come down to personal preference to some degree, but the big thing to know is the higher you go with your field of view, the wider you can see, and therefore the more information you can gain at any given time. However, the higher you go, the smaller targets at a distance will appear on your screen, and some people may not like that so much, so you don't necessarily want to crank it all the way to the max, but also going all the way to the minimum makes it look like you're looking through a straw. So for me, I like sitting around the 90 to 100 range, but again, personal preference here. Just don't complain too much if you crank this all the way to 120 and you suddenly can't see targets very well at really long ranges. As for our aim down sight field of view, I like using affected. This just means that if I have my field of view cranked up a bit and I aim down sight, you're still going to have that cranked up a bit more than if you had default field of view. And then we have another interesting setting here that I really like the idea of them including, and this is the weapon field of view setting. This allows you to have narrow, default, or wide, and it's supposed to determine how big the gun will appear on your screen depending on what your field of view is. And I wanted to do a nice comparison for you guys to show you the difference between these settings, but unfortunately, at least in the beta's current state, this doesn't actually change anything. This setting isn't working. The difference between narrow and wide is non-existent. It's literally identical. So this one, don't even worry about it for now, at least. Once they end up fixing this, maybe I'll do a little comparison video for you guys. Now, when it comes to the brightness setting, this is something I've talked about plenty in previous Call of Duty games, but I'm going to bring it up again. I highly recommend leaving your brightness setting at 50 and adjust your monitor or TV accordingly. Now, the reason for this is in Call of Duty, for whatever reason, when you crank this brightness setting up, it tends to just really wash the game out. Even if you're tuning it properly for your TV or monitor and you're making sure that that middle one is barely visible and everything, it tends to wash things out as soon as you start bumping it up too much, and you're much better off just bumping up the brightness on your TV or monitor. So that's my recommendation when it comes to that one. Now, let's move into the audio settings, and with this one, I personally found headphone bass boost gives you the clearest footstep audio. It's essentially a free wall hack in this game, which I don't really like, but I'm of course going to take advantage of it because everybody else is going to be doing it. So if you want to hear footsteps loud and clear, this is the setting that seems to work best, at least for me and my particular setup. Then when it comes to all these sliders, just tune them how you'd like. I don't like having music volume on, but that's often because I'm just sitting in menus a lot while I'm working on videos, and I don't want to hear that constantly playing in my head. And I also like to turn my dialogue volume down a little bit so it doesn't get in the way of important game audio. As for the rest of these audio settings, these are all just personal preference and everything. I do like the classic hit marker sounds though. The new Modern Warfare hit marker sounds, I'm not a big fan of them. I don't think they're very loud or punchy. The classic ones are still not very loud or punchy, but I do prefer those. And now let's move into our interface settings. And with this, you want to make sure your minimap's set to square. I just left all of these just standard. I think these are just fine as they are with standard. However, the important part here that you should definitely be turning on if you want to monitor what's going on in your game is the telemetry settings. You want to open up the Show More tab here, and I would recommend at the very least showing server latency as well as packet loss. And what this will do is in real time while you're playing the game, you'll just see this on the top left of your screen, and that just lets you know if there's anything going on the connection side of things that's potentially causing issues in the game. And with that, that's going to wrap it up for the best settings that I've found so far for the Modern Warfare 2 beta, and I've definitely noticed a big difference after going in and changing all of these individual settings. The game looks and feels quite a bit better, and hopefully this was able to help you guys. And with that, I am curious to hear from you guys. What are you thinking about the interface here so far when it comes to the Modern Warfare 2 beta, as well as the settings that they provided? Personally, I think the settings are fairly robust, and I do like them, even though some of them aren't quite working yet, but we can just chalk that up to a beta, I hope. However, the UI I find very annoying to navigate. I'm not a big fan of the UI they've got here. It's not super intuitive, and it's definitely going to have a learning curve to it. And generally speaking, when it comes to UI, that's not really a good sign of a well-developed UI. It should be really intuitive, but those are just my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.